In the summer of 1976, the Canadian government announced what would become one of the most catastrophic infrastructure projects in modern history. The Montreal Olympic Games had just concluded, leaving behind a stadium so expensive, so monumentally over budget, that it would take the province of Quebec 3 decades to pay off the debt. But this isn't a story about the Olympics. This is about something far worse. Because while Montreal was still counting the cost of its Olympic disaster, another nation was about to embark on a megaproject so ambitious, so staggeringly expensive, that it would bring an entire country to its knees. A project that would consume more than the nation's entire GDP. A project that would spark international investigations, topple governments, and leave a legacy of debt that would haunt generations. This is the story of the Bataan nuclear power plant and how it nearly bankrupted the Philippines. To understand how a single construction project could threaten to destroy a nation's economy, we need to go back to 1973. The world was in the grip of the first oil crisis. OPEC had imposed an embargo, oil prices quadrupled, and energy-dependent nations scrambled for alternatives. The Philippines was particularly vulnerable. As an archipelago of over 7,000 islands, the country relied heavily on imported oil for electricity generation. When prices skyrocketed, blackouts became routine. Industries struggled, the economy suffered. Ferdinand Marcos, who had declared martial law just a year earlier, saw an opportunity. Nuclear power, Marcos declared, would be the Philippines' salvation. It was clean, modern, and most importantly, it would free the nation from dependence on foreign oil. The Philippines would become the first Southeast Asian nation with a nuclear power plant. It would be a symbol of progress, of technological achievement, of the Philippines taking its rightful place among developed nations. The vision was intoxicating. One nuclear power plant could generate 621 megawatts of electricity, enough to power millions of homes. It would industrialize the nation, create jobs, establish the Philippines as a regional power. There was just one problem. The Philippines had no experience with nuclear technology, no regulatory framework, no trained personnel, and most critically, no realistic budget for such an undertaking. None of this seemed to matter. In 1973, the Philippine Atomic Energy Commission recommended a site in Bataan Province along Manila Bay. The location seemed perfect from a political standpoint. It was close enough to Manila to demonstrate progress, but far enough away to keep any concerns at arm's length. Engineers, however, were not so enthusiastic. The site sat near a major fault line. It was within 40 kilometers of at least 4 active volcanoes, including Mount Pinatubo and Mount Natib. The area was prone to earthquakes and tsunamis. In fact, the site was so geologically unstable that it violated several international safety standards. But Marcos had made his decision. The Bataan nuclear power plant would be built. What happened next would become a masterclass in corruption, incompetence, and the dangers of unchecked ambition. Now, before we dive into how this project spiraled into one of history's greatest financial disasters, if you're finding this story as fascinating as I did researching it, consider subscribing to the channel. We dive deep into megaprojects, engineering disasters, and the incredible true stories behind the world's most ambitious undertakings. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next, because trust me, this story is about to take some wild turns. All right, let's get back to the Philippines and watch this dream turn into a nightmare. In 1974, the Philippine government opened bidding for the nuclear power plant contract. Several international companies expressed interest, but the competition was far from fair. Westinghouse Electric Corporation, an American company, submitted a bid of $500 million. General Electric proposed a similar reactor for around $700 million. Both were established nuclear contractors with proven track records. Then something unusual happened. Westinghouse suddenly revised its bid upward to $1.2 billion, more than double its original proposal. Stranger still, despite being significantly more expensive than its competitors, Westinghouse won the contract. How did this happen? The answer lies in one of the most brazen corruption schemes in modern history. Herminio Dicini, a close friend and golfing partner of President Marcos, just happened to be Westinghouse's local agent. Dicini would receive a commission on the contract. The exact amount has been disputed, but investigations later suggested it was somewhere between $50 million and $80 million, paid directly to Dicini for his role in securing the deal. But Dicini wasn't working alone. Evidence emerged that Marcos himself received kickbacks. His wife, Imelda Marcos, allegedly received payments. high-ranking government officials all seemed to have their hands in the pot. The corruption was so obvious, so blatant, that the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission would later investigate Westinghouse for bribery. The company eventually settled without admitting wrongdoing, but the damage to its reputation was done. But here's where it gets even worse. The inflated contract price was just the beginning. The original $1.2 billion budget began to balloon almost immediately. Change orders, modifications, and necessary improvements kept adding to the cost. By 1976, the price had risen to $1.4 billion. By 1978, it was $1.9 billion. By the time construction halted in 1984, the total cost had reached $2.3 billion. To put this in perspective, in 1984, the Philippines' entire GDP was approximately $32 billion. This single power plant consumed more than 7% of the nation's total economic output. Imagine the United States spending $1.8 trillion on a single building project today. That's the relative scale of what the Philippines had committed to. And remember, this was all being done with borrowed money. The Philippines took out massive loans from international banks to finance the project. The terms were brutal: high interest rates, short repayment periods, and clauses that put the country's economic sovereignty at risk. The government promised that once operational, the plant would generate revenue that would easily cover the debt. Electricity would be cheap and abundant. Industries would flourish. The economy would boom. It was a fantasy built on corruption and optimism in equal measure. Because while the price tag soared and the debt mounted, another problem was emerging, one that would prove even more catastrophic than the financial burden. The plant itself was a disaster. Construction on the Bataan nuclear power plant began in 1976 with great fanfare. Marcos personally presided over the groundbreaking ceremony. Newspapers celebrated the dawn of the Philippines' nuclear age. The future had arrived. But almost immediately, problems emerged. Quality control was virtually non-existent. Inspectors later found more than 4,000 defects in the plant's construction. Welds were substandard. Pipes were installed incorrectly. Safety systems were compromised. Workers, many of whom had no experience with nuclear construction, were rushed through training programs that lasted mere weeks, instead of the months or years typically required. Corners were cut at every turn. Materials that should have been nuclear grade were substituted with cheaper alternatives. Documentation was falsified. Inspection reports were doctored. In 1979, the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident occurred in Pennsylvania. It was the worst nuclear disaster in American history at that time, and it sent shockwaves through the global nuclear industry. Safety standards were immediately tightened. Regulatory oversight intensified. In the Philippines, the accident barely caused a pause. Construction continued, though now under increased scrutiny from international observers and a growing domestic anti-nuclear movement. Geologists repeatedly warned that the site was unsuitable. In 1980, Mount Natib, just 25 kilometers from the plant, showed increased seismic activity. Scientists cautioned that a major eruption could be catastrophic. The warnings were ignored. Environmental groups protested. Opposition politicians raised alarms. International nuclear safety experts expressed grave concerns. The Marcos government dismissed them all. Then, in 1986, everything changed. The People Power Revolution swept through the Philippines. Marcos, facing massive protests and losing the support of the military, fled the country. Corazon Aquino took office as the new president, inheriting a nation in crisis and a nuclear power plant that had never generated a single watt of electricity. Aquino ordered an immediate investigation into the Bataan plant. What investigators found was horrifying. The plant had been built on an earthquake fault line in direct violation of international safety standards. Nearby volcanoes posed an unacceptable risk. The construction was riddled with defects. Some equipment had been installed backwards. Critical safety systems were non-functional. The plant, investigators concluded, was completely unsafe to operate. In the same year, another nuclear disaster struck. Chernobyl exploded, spreading radiation across Europe and killing thousands. The images of the destroyed reactor and the abandoned city of Pripyat horrified the world. For the Philippines, the timing couldn't have been more significant. The idea of activating a poorly built nuclear plant next to active volcanoes, after seeing what nuclear disasters could do, became politically impossible. President Aquino made the decision. The Bataan nuclear power plant would never be activated. $2.3 billion had been spent. Not a single kilowatt of electricity would ever be generated. But the nightmare was only beginning. Here's the truly devastating part of this story. Even though the plant never operated, the Philippines still had to pay for it. The loans taken out to build the plant came due. Interest accumulated. The debt grew and grew and grew. In 1986, the Philippines owed approximately $2.3 billion for the plant. By the time the debt was finally paid off in 2007, the country had paid more than $2.8 billion, including interest. Think about that. The Philippines paid nearly $3 billion for a power plant that never produced a single watt of electricity. For 21 years, Filipino taxpayers sent money every month to international banks to pay for a monument to corruption and incompetence. The economic impact was staggering. Money that could have gone to schools, hospitals, infrastructure, poverty reduction, all of it went to servicing the debt on a useless power plant. The Philippines' debt to GDP ratio soared. The country struggled to attract foreign investment. Economic growth stagnated. While neighboring nations like South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore experienced rapid development, the Philippines fell behind. Economists have estimated that the Bataan plant debt cost the Philippines decades of potential economic growth. Entire generations grew up in a country hampered by a debt incurred before they were born, for a project they would never benefit from. The social cost was equally severe. Poverty rates remained high. Healthcare and education systems were underfunded. Infrastructure projects were delayed or canceled. The debt payment became a national burden that affected every aspect of Filipino life. But perhaps the most tragic aspect is what the Philippines could have done with that money. At $2.8 billion in 1980s and 1990s, money could have built hundreds of schools, thousands of hospitals, modern transportation networks, clean water systems, agricultural development programs. Instead, it went to paying for a rusting, abandoned shell of a building sitting on the coast of Bataan province. For years after its closure, the Bataan nuclear power plant sat empty, a ghostly monument to failed ambition. Security guards patrolled the facility. Maintenance crews kept the structure from completely deteriorating. The Philippine government spent an estimated $40,000 per day just maintaining a plant that would never operate. Occasional proposals emerged to complete the plant or convert it to something else, but none ever materialized. The facility was simply too compromised, too dangerous, too politically toxic to ever serve its intended purpose. In recent years, the site has become an unlikely tourist attraction. The Philippine government offers tours of the facility, allowing visitors to walk through the never-used control rooms and see the reactor that never came online. It stands as a cautionary tale, a physical reminder of what happens when ambition exceeds wisdom, when corruption overwhelms common sense, when the desire for prestige blinds leaders to reality. But the story doesn't quite end there. The Bataan nuclear power plant scandal had lasting repercussions beyond just the debt. It contributed to a deep skepticism of large government projects in the Philippines. It damaged the country's international reputation. It served as a case study in how not to pursue development. Investigations into the corruption surrounding the project continued for decades. Some officials faced prosecution, others fled the country. The full extent of the kickbacks and bribes has never been completely revealed. Ferdinand Marcos died in exile in 1989, never facing full accountability for the project. Herminio Dicini eventually returned to the Philippines and lived quietly until his death in 2014. Westinghouse paid fines, but never admitted to wrongdoing. Today, the Philippines still relies heavily on imported energy. The dream of energy independence that the nuclear plant was supposed to provide remains unfulfilled. The country continues to grapple with power shortages and high electricity costs. But here's the most important lesson from this disaster. The Bataan nuclear power plant failed, not because nuclear power is inherently bad or because the Philippines was incapable of such a project. It failed because of corruption, because safety was sacrificed for profit, because warnings were ignored, and because the people making decisions prioritized personal gain over public good. Megaprojects can transform nations. They can lift millions out of poverty, connect communities, and drive progress. But they can also become monuments to greed when oversight fails, when corruption takes hold, and when ambition isn't tempered by reality. The Bataan nuclear power plant nearly bankrupted the Philippines. In many ways, it cost the nation far more than money. It cost opportunity, progress, and decades of development. And all of it for a building that sits empty by the sea, its turbines silent, its reactor cold, a $3 billion reminder that sometimes the most expensive projects are the ones that never work at all.